Hello, everybody, and welcome to Roadie on the Horn. My name, as usual, is Donovan, and I'm here with my co-host Ryan, and we have a recurring guest. We have somebody that's come back for a second appearance, which is, definitely shocking. But we'll start with Ryan. Ryan, how are you doing today?
I am doing awesome, Donnie. Thank you for asking. Really excited to be recording our podcast. And actually, this is our guest's third episode. We had our friend Josh join us for an episode before, and then we had so many questions that we invited him for the preceding next podcast. So we're really glad to have him back. So Josh, how you doing, man?
Yeah, so hi, this is Josh again, Mr. I Hate Lettuce 2 himself. Really excited to be back and talk some more baseball, and I wish I had some of my own ridiculous questions to answer today, but sadly I don't. So I'll send it back to you guys.
Yeah, it's definitely appreciated that we get the random questions out of you that, I'd say you stump us more than anybody else does, just because there's pop culture references occasionally. You ask about North Face, which is, I'm be honest, I had no clue what was going on, and you phrased it as if it was a big scandal, and RK was the same way. But that is besides the point, because it teaches us something. But this is a sports podcast. I think the best thing we can do is get into sports, and I think the biggest event that we've had in March, at least March Madness, is still going on, and we've had some big upsets here. RK, we'll start with you because I know you've been watching quite a lot. Has anything really just jumped out other than we've seen UCLA make what I would consider a Cinderella run? At this point, how do you think March Madness went so far? Any real just shockers there, or has everything went kind of status quo in terms of what we have right now?
Yeah, it's been an interesting tournament for sure. The scheduling is a little bit different. I'm always kind of thrown off. Now we've got games on Tuesdays and Wednesdays for the tournament, and definitely not accustomed to that. Obviously, new schedule this year, just given the fact that all the games are in the state of Indiana, so they can kind of do things a little bit more flexible around that. So outside of kind of the scheduling, I think the basketball has been good so far. I mean, definitely had some upsets. As you mentioned, UCLA as one of those teams making it all the way to the Final Four as an 11 seed. They were in kind of that play-in round all the way back when the tournament started, and now here they are. But, outside of that, we've got 1s and 2 seeds all the way making it through. Gonzaga, Baylor, Houston, the other teams left in the Final Four. I still think Gonzaga, they haven't lost a game this year, so why would anyone go against them? But, no, Baylor and Houston have had really good seasons as well. Good to see them in the Final Four as well. But it's been good basketball, so I'm looking forward to the Final Four on Saturday.
Josh, how's the boycott going?
I didn't watch too many games. I was just in Dallas visiting some of my friends for the weekend. But I'm actually really excited for the national championship because I think that we are actually going to be seeing Gonzaga and Baylor, who are truly the two best teams in the country, playing each other. I don't really think that I've been a little disappointed in this tournament. I mean, other than the fact that I'm an Ohio State fan and we lost to Oral Roberts in the first round. Yeah, very, very tough. But it hasn't felt like there's been a lot of close games recently, after the first round. I mean, it's there's been upsets, but it doesn't feel any more than usual. Because, I think a lot of us kind of forgot after the year off. We're 2 years removed from our last time actually watching March Madness, that we kind of forgot exactly how many upsets there really are. How, a lot of people has had a lot of chalk in their brackets, and then Illinois, Ohio State, Big 10, Big 12, all of them just shit the bed. And, I think all of us forgot just how bad it really gets and how unpredictable it is. So,
yeah, So I have a friend that was talking to me about his bracket. This is the first time he's ever made a bracket, and he was really confused as to why his bracket was so fucked up. Pardon my French. After the first 2 rounds, and I think this is the definite. I don't know. This is something that happens every time that March Madness happens, regardless of whether you pick it or not. It's Obviously, I don't think anybody really foresaw Ohio State losing, especially considering they played very, very well leading up to the tournament, and I had never heard of Oral Roberts as a school before. So that's definitely a little disappointing. And then, obviously Illinois bowing out early after having another great lead up to the tournament. But yeah, I don't know. I definitely agree with you on the whole. There haven't really been many close games recently. It's like we saw Oregon State Houston was decent. Last night, time of recording, UCLA Michigan was a good game. Really, really low scoring, which is not something that I had expected. They put up 100 points between the two of them, which is extremely low for college basketball. But in general, I think as I think both of you mentioned before, obviously Gonzaga, no real shocker there. They're not really struggling at all. And then on the other side, Baylor didn't really struggle at all either. And Baylor's had a very hard tournament too. They've played Villanova, Arkansas, Wisconsin, so that they've played some decent teams there. At this point in the Final Four, first off, does UCLA have any chance against Gonzaga? And I'll leave that open. First off, Ryan, you can go ahead.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's been a nice run for UCLA, but I mean, hey, I don't think anyone's going to take down Gonzaga. Like Josh said, I expect them at the very least to make it all the way to the title game. So that would surprise me a lot.
Okay, Josh, I'm thinking you're along the same lines here.
Yeah, I mean, like UCLA, like I did think that it was really good, like in their tournament, but then, so I mean, I think Gonzaga is just so good. And then Baylor and Houston, I mean, like I haven't been too impressed with Houston. I mean, like obviously they're in the Final Four, but like if you look at who they played, I don't think that they've, after the first round, played more than the 7 or 9 seems like the highest they played or the lowest they played. So
yeah, so the highest they've played is actually Rutgers, I think, who was a 10 seed. So yeah, definitely. I mean, there are teams that benefit off of matchups every time. Obviously, upsets are the reason that we set up here. But I do think that's a good point. And I've seen a lot of people say, "Oh, you can't really count out Houston because they play good defense," but they're also defending teams that barely made the tournament. So it's like Rutgers pretty much barely made the tournament as a 10, and then you had. I didn't even know Syracuse was good, and then Syracuse played, and it was great. They got slapped by Houston. That's fine. And then Oregon State was another team that really just came out of nowhere. Obviously one of those Pac teams that did really well. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. Houston plays defensive basketball, and it's gonna be very hard to defend Baylor. So I definitely agree with you guys. So in thoughts of the entire tournament, how everything has played out and how games have been so far, do you think this has been a good tournament considering, or do you think it's been a little bit lackluster, left a lot to desire? We'll start with Ryan here.
Yeah, I think it's gone pretty well, I would say. I think that everything, considered, obviously we wanted to kind of avoid COVID interrupting things, that we saw that in the first round with that VCU and Oregon game having to be kind of deemed a forfeit for Oregon to move on. But since then, I think they've done a nice job kind of handling things, and seems like that we've gone through things without too much disruption. So I think the tournament's gone pretty well from my perspective, at least when it comes to the standpoint of wanting to make sure that we can get as many games as we can in.
That's fair. Josh?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought that overall they've done a good job of like keeping it going and everything with like the COVID restraints. I think the only thing that's really missing about this year with the tournament is it's like none of like the big name players other than like Jalen Suggs are really in the Final Four still. It's like there wasn't like Ayo DeSumo, and Luka Garza, like a lot of the big time players.
Cade Cunningham,
all of them were just out like round of 32, and it's like you only got to see him play for such a small amount of time, so that was a little disappointing. But other than that, and then I mean, there's been like the upsets. There's been like the regions where there's chaos, and it's fun, but it's also like they do a good job handling it. But I think we've just had better action in other years from it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, actually. I've seen a lot of people say, oh, it's really good to have this normalcy back and all that, but it doesn't really feel like necessarily a normal tournament to me, knowing, obviously, behind the scenes, there have been some NCAA issues, as we've talked about, and then, maybe not the best basketball that we've ever had. It's like obviously we've had some upsets. It's nice to see late games, but as Josh said before, a lot of these games haven't been close, and you'd expect. I see. My thought is the first round we should have half of the games should be blowouts at least. That's kind of how the matchups work. And then as you get closer in the tournament, things get a little bit more. I wouldn't say necessarily close, but I would say there are more tightly contested games. Whereas you can look at, like, for example, the Sweet 16 games. On the left side of that bracket, we didn't really have any close games. The closest game was UCLA beating Bama by 10. And then on the right side of the bracket, it's like, Houston is beating Syracuse. Syracuse puts up 46 points in an entire game, and that's a snooze fest. And then Oregon State and Loyola, people didn't really care about the game in the first place, I don't think, because everybody knew neither of these teams were really, like, legit. The only close game we had in the Sweet 16 in general was Arkansas Oral Roberts, and again, it's like, you want to root for the underdog, but if that's the closest game that you have in the entire all 8 games in terms of the best 16 teams in college basketball, apparently, definitely lackluster a little bit. But I would say overall, I think it's just surprising that they've avoided COVID to this extent. Obviously, having a game canceled is not ideal, but you kind of think, especially when there's not necessarily it's very hard to hold a bunch of college students in their hotels for an extended period of time. And I've definitely seen people on Tinder and such. I saw a TikTok where this girl was swiping through Tinder and all these college basketball players were there. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's a little bit surprising that they've had maybe less issues than expected, but maybe that's a good sign for the future of sports in general. Any last thoughts on March Madness, Ryan, Josh? Anybody got anything?
I'm still boycotting. Nothing to do with the fact that Ohio State lost in the first
Understandable.
round. Everything to do with the treatment of women with their weight room.
That's very fair, because I was about to interject and make fun of Josh for deactivating his account after Ohio State lost, but he actually had a nice curveball there with the inequality with the NCAA, so that's okay. I will let that slide. But I know we definitely have some questions as it relates to March Madness, so I know we usually do questions in kind of succession, but it's relating to kind of our conversation here. So I'll kind of interject here with one question we have from our friend Trey, and his question, very insightful one here, so I'll read it out. Here we go. When limited amount of conference games are played, how should measurement of success be changed? It's hard to measure how good a conference is and the strength of schedule when you mostly play your conference. This year, a lot of Big Ten teams made the tournament because people thought the conference was loaded, but in reality, it was slightly overrated. To go along with that, what teams shouldn't have made the tourney, and which teams do you think should have, looking back? Most salty, Memphis didn't get in when they went toe-to-toe with the Final Four teams and smoked the NIT field. So, interesting thought from Trey. A lot of things to kind of digest there. I think it is interesting, especially in the past year we've had, not even just in college basketball, when it comes to teams really only kind of playing teams within your conference, but this is something we saw in college football as well. Very few out-of-conference games. A lot of those got canceled across the NCAA, and even in the NHL this year, there's reduced travel with each team playing within their own division. Obviously, that happened because of the situation in Canada, being it difficult for teams to come across and whatnot, so they just kind of formed their own Canadian division. But we see that across sports with that kind of idea that they're trying to maybe, reduce travel and the spread of COVID by only having you play within that conference. So as it kind of relates to the Big Ten here, to kind of go into this, it's definitely true. In college basketball, throughout the regular season, we were like, oh, wow, look out. The Big Ten, definitely the best college conference in college basketball. Then we get to the tournament, and a lot of these teams are bounced early. Michigan, really the only team that makes a decent run, and then they get bounced before the Final Four, even them. So definitely an interesting thought there. So I guess I'll go to Josh here first. What is kind of your thoughts on how we can kind of evaluate the balance of play and competition between different leagues when they're only playing within that same conference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you don't really want to take too much stock into a conference like before the season and have preconceived notions. But I think that schools like the Big Ten, what kind of showed is that it was a lot of good schools, but not horrible schools. I mean, it's even some of the teams that didn't make the tournament or barely made the tournament, they could still play. I mean, they were still fighting with other teams. They were winning some out of conference games. It was just that they didn't really have too many teams that were as good as we thought, and then everyone gave them credit for all these wins against, the better Big Ten teams, and it propped them up, but they really didn't deserve being propped up. And I think one of the things also to do that is to introduce more of these the different tournaments for non-conference games towards the middle of the season instead of having it be in the beginning of the season. So those tournaments help you draw fan interest earlier in the season at a time when it's usually pretty low, because a lot of schools are still focusing on their football season and everything. And it's just it's hard to really draw that much interest into it. But I think that the best way to do it would be to add some more of these out of conference games towards the middle of the season.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think we've seen a little bit of that. I know the SEC, ACC, Big 12, Big 10, they try to have some of those challenges throughout the season. I know the Big 10 ACC challenge is mostly towards the beginning of the year, but sometimes I think moving it towards the middle of the year could be a good option. I like that suggestion a lot. And we even did see some out of conference from some Big 10 teams this year. Iowa played Gonzaga. Illinois played Baylor. Both those teams lost in those games, and we were just talking about it. Gonzaga, Baylor, probably the two best teams in college basketball. So the Big Ten did have their shot at some of those teams and came up short. So I do think there's some element to that maybe we thought the Big Ten was better than it was in the regular season. Obviously, it's easy to say that looking back. Pretty much all of them got next, pretty early in the tournament. So maybe we're kind of benefiting from, the hindsight there. But Donnie, any kind of thoughts from you on kind of this conversation when it comes to really only kind of playing teams in your conference and how to kind of evaluate them at a national scale?
Well, see, it's so I think my example here would be basically the Pac-12 in general. So we've seen them make multiple teams make deep runs, and a lot of these teams were not seeded very highly and not given much of a chance to go far. It's we talked about our locks to move on, and it's I thought USC had a great chance considering they have NBA level talent on their roster. It's not you go 25-8 in the season playing teams that do recruit semi well for basketball. It's not like these guys are all slouches. But the highest ranked Pac team was 22 at the end of the season rankings, and then it's we had a bunch of 6 seeds. Or Oregon State came in not even looking like a real team, and bang, there you go. They made a huge run, albeit shortened by Houston. I don't know. I think it's really hard, especially at a time like this where there were a lot of games that were maybe not necessarily canceled, but they had issues with players having COVID or players being on the list. Or I saw there were multiple coaches talking about how this was the toughest year they've ever coached, considering they had maybe not a shortened bench, but they had 8-9 players they could use, which I mean is semi-normal, missing out on starters and such. And yeah, there are definitely teams that missed the tournament that probably could have had a better shot. But again, at this point, I don't know. I think this year is just a mulligan. This is a year that we ignore and go from there. It's very hard for anybody to really tell me that they could have done anything better, considering they put a lot of time and stock into these things. But yeah, I don't know. There's always going to be conferences that overperform, and again, there's going to be conferences that underperform. It's how it goes every year. While I'm a little bit surprised that we are where we are without having other teams make deeper runs, I think they did a mostly good job. And again, it's if you miss this year, you can chalk it up to COVID and call it a day, I think.
Yeah, I like that analysis there. Then last part of Josh, any other thoughts from you on that?
Just one quick thought that it's the Big 10 and Big 12 not doing so good and the Pac-12 doing really good might make me adjust how I do my brackets in the future. I might just make one for money that I just say, oh, everyone thinks this conference is good. Well, I'm just going to assume that they're bad. They're going to do bad or whatever, because
that could be it. You got to play the percentages in March Madness. You really do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then last part of Trey's question here, he's talking about Memphis. Trey's a big Memphis fan. as well. They won all the way in the NIT. So again, here hindsight, but I guess we could look back and say, well, Michigan State, they didn't have a great record. They were 15-13 this season. They did make the tournament, lost actually in overtime to UCLA in that first round. So that's kind of interesting. Obviously, UCLA going all the way to the Final Four now. But yeah, I guess now we can look back and say, well, maybe Memphis or a team like Colorado State. I know St. Louis was another team that got some considerations. So good question there from Trey. Really kind of a fun conversation there as it relates to kind of how we evaluate teams in the last year with some interesting scheduling things. So good conversation there. And then we do have a lot of baseball questions and thoughts. We got a preview where we're going to go through each division, but Trey's got one more question for us before we get into that. So kind of an interesting one here. Just wants to talk about all-time sports busts. So this is a lot of fun. Trey has asked us before, a big Tennessee Titans fan as well, a lot about Isaiah Wilson, the Titans' first-round pick. Terrible year, disaster with the Titans, was moved to Miami, and Miami already cut him. So it's been a disaster for Isaiah Wilson. So that kind of brought up this conversation of all-time sports bust. I'm going to throw out two names, and then I'll turn it over to Josh and Donnie to share some names as well on some busts. But for me, the two that really came to mind, Ryan Leaf, obviously NFL, former quarterback, and then Kwame Brown as well for basketball. So yeah, those were really two big busts that kind of came to mind for me there. So Donnie, I'll go to you here. All-time sports bust. Who comes to mind for you?
So I actually thought about this question a little bit because we've had a similar question before, and I think one answer that we generally don't talk about is Anthony Bennett, the Cleveland Cavaliers first overall pick. He has been completely forgotten just in general in terms of NBA lore. We forget. So 2013, he was in the NBA draft. He was a Canadian, UNLV, very, very good prospect. It looked like, very athletic. But obviously there were some better players taken. That was the Giannis draft. He was taken above Oladipo, who is an all-star. Yeah, I think that is one that we generally ignore in terms of just all-time busts, considering I don't think you could do much worse as a number one pick than Anthony Bennett did. It's like he came in, it was very, very mediocre, and then gone. Like he can't even get a G League contract at this point. So that's definitely a toughie for him. I'll bring up a couple more. The first, mostly basketball players, because I think that's something that will be ignored here. But it's like, for example, Greg Oden. Obviously injuries hurt, but Greg Oden, another guy that was basically projected to be a Hall of Fame type player, a very, very talented type player coming out of the draft, and injuries obviously held him back at that point. And I think that's something that you can't really hold against a player like that necessarily. I think it's very hard to say, oh, a 7 foot player, it's gonna be tough for him to have a great career if he has injuries, which it goes from there. And then I'll bring up the other, Kwame Brown from the Washington Wizards. Kwame Brown is obviously, if you don't know about Kwame Brown, Stephen A. Smith, that's basically all you need. But yeah, I think that him, Bennett, and Oden are three of the biggest draft busts ever in the NBA. And Oden in a different class of his own wasn't really his fault, but the other two, they were just bad. But those are my picks.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say there. Bennett is a really good one, Donnie. I did forget about Anthony Bennett, but that is a very good one. And then I was gonna say with Greg Oden, it's hard for me to consider a guy his fault for a bust if he just lost all his cartilage in his knee. That's tough for Greg Oden. I wish that didn't happen for him either. So, but that is a good one for sure. Josh, how about you? Any all-time sports bust? What comes to mind for you?
This one I do not know how to say his name. I'm not even going to try, but one